you can learn the skill of being able to do the things that you do in your life that you need to do, even when you don't feel like it. That's really the heart of procrastination for most people, is not doing something because they don't feel like doing it. So think about what you could accomplish in your life if you could do the things that are important for you to do, even when you don't feel like doing them.
Hello, everyone. I'm Larry Weeks. Welcome to the Bounce Podcast. Here's something you already know how to do, even if you've never thought about it this way. You act without wanting to. You get out of bed in the morning when you don't feel like it, to go to a job that you have to get to take your kids to school, whatever. You do your taxes when you'd rather do almost anything else. In hundreds of small ways, you've proven that you can act even when your feelings fight back. So why is it then that when there's something you really want the results of doing, you just can't seem to get yourself to do it? The workout you skip, the dream project you keep putting off. Why is there a if this then that kind of script running that we can't decouple in these circumstances? My guest on the show today says the problem is a hidden assumption most of us are living by, that we have to feel motivated, we have to feel happy or confident before we can act, that we need to fix the feelings going on inside us first. And he says that's exactly backwards. My guest is Gregg Krech. Gregg is the executive director of the ToDo Institute Education and Retreat Center in Vermont. He's also the author of several books, including Gratitude, Grace, and the Japanese Art of Self-Reflection, A Natural Approach to Mental Wellness, The Art of Taking Action, and Question Your Life. And for nearly 30 years, Gregg has been teaching an approach called Morita therapy, developed a century ago by a Japanese psychiatrist to treat severe anxiety. And it offers a genuinely different way of dealing with the feelings that stop us. As Gregg puts it, your feelings can be in the play, they just don't have to direct it. In this conversation, we get into how you actually build that as a skill, why motivation is optional, how to work with your attention to relieve suffering in real time, how to pick yourself up after a setback, and why the smartest people often get the most stuck in their heads. It's practical, it's freeing, and I think it'll change the way you look at the gap between how you feel and what you do. So, I give you Gregg Krech. Gregg, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to be on your show, Larry.
So tell us about Institute, your background, and in Morita therapy.
I first discovered Morita therapy actually about 30 years ago this year. And in a very unglamorous way, I just happened to be in a bookstore and noticed a book on the shelf. And I had been involved at that time in the field of organizational psychology, working with businesses. And I'd always been interested in therapy and clinical psychology, but I was also deeply involved in studying Eastern philosophy and Buddhism. And I could never reconcile what I saw as the kind of self-focus that was really accentuated in most Western therapy, while I was basically studying principles from Eastern religion and philosophy that talked about selflessness and compassion and service to others. What I found was that there were several approaches to Japanese psychology, Morita therapy being one of them, and one of the others called Naikan, which were grounded in the kind of not religious but secular principles of Zen and Pure Land Buddhism, and which resonated with me because they were much closer to values and principles that I believed in terms of my spiritual path and practice. So that's kind of what first attracted me to those approaches. And Morita therapy was probably the thing that attracted me first because I had been really struggling in my life with relationships and with getting important things done and with issues of procrastination. So Morita therapy was a really good fit for me when I was in my early 30s at that time. About 1992, 25 years ago, I moved to Vermont with Linda, a woman who I was involved with at the time, who I later married and is my wife now. And we started a center called the ToDo Institute. And ToDo actually means in Japanese Eastern way, but we're often known as the ToDo Institute, which is very consistent with kind of that action orientation that Morita therapy has. And in Spanish, ToDo actually has a meaning as well. ToDo means all or everything. So the name of the organization actually is in through languages. And at the ToDo Institute, we do training in Japanese psychology, different methods. We do retreats, we do workshops, we publish a journal called 30,000 Days, a journal for purposeful living, and we publish some of our own books. So we're essentially trying to share this material with the world because I deeply believe that it can be very helpful for a lot of people.
So you were at the time contemplating psychotherapy, or is that right? And you found it wanting because of, I don't know, the modalities, or there's some dissatisfaction with it, or something didn't jive with your maybe personal philosophy.
Yes, I was studying both here and in Japan, Buddhism and Zen, and principles that I found very elegant and very wonderful to aspire to. But in a lot of Western psychotherapy, I found an overemphasis on feelings and an overemphasis on the kind of person. The focus of the therapy was often the client or the patient in a way that I think promotes self-centeredness and self-focus. And one of the things I really loved about Japanese psychology is that it shifted that attention away from yourself and to engaging with the world around you. It's almost like a theme of, it's not about me. It's about the world, and it's about living in the world. It's not just about my inner world. In fact, my inner world is really a very tiny and transient part of the larger universe. And so I love the idea of an approach to therapy that really shifted your energy away from what was going on inside you to how to live well in the world around you.
So tell us about East Japanese psychology and the differences in therapy, for lack of a better word, between the East and the West, at least at that time, and the Morita therapy specifically.
Well, Morita therapy was actually started as an approach to psychiatry in Japan by a man named Shoma Morita, who was a psychiatrist at GK University in Tokyo. And it was originally designed for people who suffered from severe anxiety, but it's really been expanded in Japan, but to a great extent in the West, to address a wide variety of problems, ranging from depression to loneliness to even procrastination. And the thing that a lot of people find very helpful is really how to move forward with important things in your life without having to fix your feelings or your inner world first. In other words, mostly when we think of having, let's say, depressed feelings, there's this view that we either express them, right, which is a lot of what we do in talk therapy, expressing what's going on inside us in terms of our feelings, or we suppress them, which is kind of hold them down and maybe don't even acknowledge them. And in Morita therapy, there's this third option, which is acceptance. It's to accept our inner state. Right now, I'm feeling very depressed. Right now, I'm feeling very anxious. But to coexist, and this is really this skill of coexisting with our inner feelings, whether that be anger or depression or anxiety or shyness, and at the same time to be able to take action in a way that is constructive and responsive to the needs of the situation you're in. So we can go up on a stage, we can feel terrible anxiety about making a presentation to a group of people at work. And instead of trying to get our inner state to be one of confidence or comfort, we can coexist with that anxiety and take it with us on the stage and have it right there as we begin to make our presentation. So there's no resistance. One of the principles you find in, for instance, martial arts in the East is this issue of non-resistance, right? So you can defeat an opponent in martial arts who's bigger and stronger than you by using their energy against them. But if you try to go up directly against them, they're coming at you and you go at them. If they're bigger and stronger, they're going to defeat you. And so it's the same kind of principle when we think about feelings like depression or anxiety. We don't want to go up directly against it because in many cases, we'll be defeated. But by non-resistance, we can actually overcome feelings of depression or anxiety or other unpleasant feeling states by simply not resisting those feelings, accepting them, but at the same time being able to take action and do the things we need to do.
So you said Morita therapy is mainly, I guess when it started, a treatment for anxiety or some type of anxiety-based therapy. Is that something culturally acute in Japan, or was it something anxiety specifically? I mean, everybody has it, but I'm just curious.
I think that one of the things that comes up frequently in terms of teaching this work in the West is people making reference to the difference between cultures. Japanese culture, Asian culture is very different than Western culture. There's no question about it. But when it comes down to things like anxiety or depression or shyness or anger, those to me are kind of common elements of the human condition. And they really go much deeper than the differences in culture. So I spent a fair amount of time training in Japan and traveling in Japan. And even though I see dramatic differences in culture, I really don't see dramatic differences from a standpoint of the human condition and of suffering. So while anxiety, I think is and was, a problem in terms of a mental health issue in Japan, I think it's just as much a problem in terms of being a mental health issue in the West.
And what would be the difference? So let's take, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy. So in treating anxiety, there are some techniques like exposure, flooding, that type of thing. Would Morita therapy use those methods, or would there be some other type of approach? How would Morita therapy differ in the treatment of anxiety?
Well, I don't feel like I'm qualified to be able to kind of capture treatment alternatives that you'd find, for instance, in cognitive behavioral therapy or other Western therapies. What I can tell you, though, that I think is a fundamental distinction is that there, in a lot of cognitive-based Western therapies, one of the things that the therapist is trying to do is to help the person change their thoughts, to avoid thinking particular thoughts or to be able to stop those thoughts and to shift them to other kinds of thoughts. That would be antithetical to an approach coming from Morita therapy, because we would see any effort to change one's thoughts as grounded in resistance. And there's a fundamental principle in Morita therapy that our thoughts and our feelings are fundamentally uncontrollable, that we can't will ourselves to think these kinds of thoughts and not think those kinds of thoughts. If my teenage daughter is supposed to be home at midnight and it's 3 a.m, I can't reach her on her phone, she's not home, I can't will myself not to think anxious thoughts. And I also can't will myself not to have anxious feelings. So we start from a premise that our internal world, primarily feelings and thoughts, are really uncontrollable. And therefore, the natural response to them and the wise response is to accept them. But that our behavior, our conduct is controllable regardless of how we're feeling. In other words, we can feel angry and not yell at someone. We can feel like we want to strangle our boss because of something that he or she said and not strangle our boss, right? So we can have these feelings and we can have these thoughts, and we don't actually need to work on them. We don't need to put that energy into our internal world. We can put it into the world we're actually living in. So I do think that's a distinction between a lot of the cognitive-based approaches to therapy that you would see in the West and Morita therapy.
What I do like about, and I've read a few books, I think it was Living Well, I think was one of the books I read. One of the things that attracted me to the content was this bias toward action. In other words, everything seemed to be pointing to how can we get you to take an action, to do something, right? In fact, there's a phrase that I've kept with me, and you can tell me who, it may be from Morita, but it goes along the lines of, for all my dreams, I only have what I do. Am I oversimplifying it? Is that pretty much the approach of Morita, is to get someone to act, to your point, despite the feeling that you may have or the emotion?
Well, I think it's a big part of Morita therapy is to get people to accept the things in their life, both their inner world and outer world, which really aren't controllable, and to be able to act in a way that is responsive to the circumstances and conditions that they're in. And that may sound kind of simple, but in most cases, our actions aren't actually a response to the conditions or circumstances. So when we open a refrigerator door, often the question that we have that's present in our conscious minds is, what do I feel like eating? So what we're really doing is we're allowing our feelings to make the determination of what food we pull out of that refrigerator and put into our bodies. But there are other questions that could be asked, like, what is it that needs to be eaten? Which has to do maybe with food that would be spoiled the next day. Or, what is my purpose here in terms of my own dietary standards and expectations? Maybe I'm on a diet, maybe I'm not eating sweets, or maybe I'm not eating gluten, or maybe I'm vegetarian, so that we respond to something different from just our feeling state. And that's a big shift from what we would call a kind of feeling-centered approach to life to a purpose-centered approach to life. And when we make that shift, because again, we can't control our feelings. And if you had like a computer printout of all of the feelings that you've had, let's say in the last month, it would probably be astounding to see the roller coaster ride of those feelings, right? Going from joy to depression to anxiety to pleasure. Even in a relationship, you think about how quickly you can shift your feelings towards the person you're with. One minute you're thinking, oh, I love this person. I'm just so lucky to be with them. And a couple of minutes later, you're thinking, I can't stand this person. I've really had it with them, right? Yeah. And that it gives you a real indication of the crazy chaos of our inner world in terms of our feelings or our emotions. If we live according to those feelings and emotions, if we allow our conduct or our behavior in the world to simply mirror what's going on inside us, we end up with a pretty chaotic life and also with a pretty purposeless life. And we're constantly changing direction. And one day we want to do this and the next day we're doing something else. And so it's a very, very difficult life. It creates a lot of suffering for us and it creates a lot of suffering for people around us. And since we can't control our inner world, what we try to do is to provide direction and wisdom and a certain stability in terms of the way we're living in the world around us, right? Our work, our family, the way we engage with people, doing our taxes, getting our car repaired, whatever it is that has to be done. If we can ground ourselves in essentially responding to what life needs in a reliable, solid kind of way, then we can allow our inner world to fluctuate like that without feeling like our life is out of control. And that's I think, what happens when people get too caught up in their inner world, is this sense that your life is out of control because your focus and your energy is so much on what's going on inside you.
I understand that intellectually. How do you do that? Let's say, because you acknowledged that thoughts are automatic, they can flood. What do you do in the middle of that flood? How do you teach someone to move on despite what I'm feeling when the feeling is overwhelming and sometimes getting off the couch may be difficult, like getting out of bed? You know what I'm asking?
Sure.
Yes.
Sure. How do people make that shift? How do you learn to do this, right? So I can give our listeners, a couple of ideas. So the first thing is that you learn with your body. This isn't something that you figure out in your mind. And that's why talk therapy doesn't leave you in a place of being more skillful at the end of that hour than you were before that hour. So in one of my books called A Natural Approach to Mental Wellness, I talk about 4 key skills. And that those skills, like the skill of playing piano or the skill of shooting free throws in basketball, those are skills that are learnable and people can learn them. But just like any of those skills, you have to practice. And that's really what it is that gets people to make that shift, is practice. So let's talk about what practice would actually look like in a practical kind of way. So let's say that you're trying to lose weight and you're on a diet and you have certain restrictions and limitations that you set for yourself. And you walk past the bakery, and in the window of the bakery is this beautiful, attractive looking large piece of carrot cake or chocolate cake. I happen to have a weakness for carrot cake, but I know there's a lot of chocolate lovers out there. So whatever your weakness is, that's what's sitting in that window, right? And you feel your enzymes kind of churning around in your stomach, and you have this feeling of attraction towards that cake, of going in there and being able to just sit down with a cup of coffee, tea, and just eat it and enjoy it. And you have these thoughts like, oh, I'm going to just give myself this one little opening to have that piece of cake because I've been doing, and then here's where all the explanations and justifications and rationales come in. Well, I've been doing really well this week, right? So I'm going to just make a little exception here because I'm only human. Or it could be, I haven't been doing well at all, so I'll just eat this cake and tomorrow I'll get back on track. So no matter how we've been doing, we can find a way to justify why it's okay to eat that cake. So we have these thoughts and we have these feelings. We even have this stuff going on chemically in our bodies. But if we can walk past that bakery window and not go in, we have just practiced coexisting with feelings and not acting on our feelings, or what we would call restraint. We have one practice experience and it was successful, right? And that's what practice looks like. In this case, it means restraint. It means feeling like doing something, but not doing it. But in other cases, it might be the opposite. It means, just like your example, it might be being on the couch and it's time to go to the gym and work out, and you really feel lazy and tired and you've had a hard day and you didn't sleep well last night. And you have all these explanations in your mind of why you shouldn't go to the gym, and you get off the couch and you go to the gym. So in both cases, you're working in a way that's antithetical to your feeling state. And as we practice doing that and start having some even limited success, we start getting better at it. We get better at noticing our thoughts, noticing our feelings, but allowing ourselves to do what it is that's important to do in our life, even when it's not consistent with those thoughts and feelings. And so we actually, in the trainings that we do, we actually have exercises. I remember running a Morita therapy group years ago in my home when I lived down in Virginia. And we would pass around a chocolate, and I would have a person hold a little plate with chocolate in it. And I'd ask them what their thoughts are about that chocolate and what their feelings are. And if the person's thoughts were, I would love to eat this chocolate, or I love chocolate, and they felt like eating it, I would just say, notice those thoughts, accept those thoughts, and pass the chocolate on to the next person. And they would do that. And of course, there's a feeling of disappointment and frustration. Those feelings have to be accepted as well. And if it would get to someone and they would say, I actually had a big dinner. I'm really not that hungry. I don't really feel like eating this piece of chocolate. So it's not really a problem for me. And I would say, that's great. Go ahead and eat the chocolate. Great. In other words, either way, what I want you to learn to do is not to just automatically go with your feelings. And so there's lots of exercises like that give people an opportunity to learn how to do something that isn't just dictated by their feeling state. One of the metaphors I like to use is thinking about your life as a play, right? And for a lot of people, the director of that play is their feelings. Feelings decide what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, how you're going to do it, if you're going to do it. And when we make this kind of shift, it's not that we're getting rid of our feelings. And that's really a misunderstanding of Morita therapy, that we just ignore our feelings. Feelings aren't important at all. What we're really doing is we're changing the role of feelings from the director to an actor in the play. And so now the director position is open. And who's going to fill that position? What's going to fill that position of who's directing the play? So for some people, that could be their purpose. For some people, that could be their goals. For someone who's religious, it could be God, right? But your feelings are still in the play, but they're not running the show. They're not directing things. And it's a huge difference in how we live our life once we're able to actually make that change. And we make that change. We learn to do this by basically doing it, by practicing it, just like we would learn to play the guitar, just like we would learn to play tennis. It's a skill and it's learnable, but we can't learn it by talking about it or reading about it. We have to basically practice.
I like the play metaphor. I like that because for me, it's a floodlight that's shining on what may be happening in your life, who is running your life, in the sense that many people could be going to and fro just based on their feelings, right? Mm-hmm. And then you have to ask, what has my feelings gotten me? So if I'm afraid to talk to people, I may be very lonely. So mm-hmm. your feelings may have led you, and I'm not saying everybody, but your feelings may have led you to results in your life that you really don't want.
And I think that's true of your thoughts in many cases. I mean, just think about the chocolate cake example, right? You go into that bakery and you order the piece of cake and you sit there and you actually enjoy it for a few minutes and you love it, you love chocolate. And those thoughts that were saying when you were standing outside, oh, go ahead. You deserve a piece of chocolate cake today. You've been working hard. You've been doing good on your diet. And you walk out of the bakery and the same mind that created those thoughts now is giving you thoughts like, you shouldn't have done that. You just messed up your diet. Why did you do that? You have no willpower at all, do you? And so this is the same mind, right? If we had a friend following us around who would do that, who would basically say, hey, why don't you do this? And as soon as we did it, they would say, that was stupid. How long would we stay friends with that person?
Yeah.
So we have to realize that our thoughts and feelings aren't always giving us very good advice.
The first precept you gave is you learn with your body. And so one of the ways to execute on the take action form of living and coexisting with your feelings is to practice before you're maybe tested. So you gave an example of maybe passing a chocolate around and mm-hmm. feeling the temptation, but realizing you're in control. You don't have to give in. So are we talking about willpower, Gregg?
I think that is a big part of what we're talking about, but we're actually talking about it in a very functional, operational way. And what does it actually mean to exercise willpower. And what it really means is that we have the ability to behave in a way that, at least in some cases, goes against what we're feeling and thinking. And, that may, some people sound radical or to other people sound like heresy, but I do that virtually every single morning when I get out of bed. I never feel like getting out of bed. It may be that there are people out there who just, they wake up and they say, I can't wait to start the day. That's not me. I feel sluggish and tired. I usually have thoughts like I didn't sleep enough or why did I go to bed so late? So when I get out of bed, I'm almost always going against my feelings because I almost never feel like getting out of bed. So I don't think that there's anything wrong with basically going against your feelings. And I think actually in many cases, it's what we need to do in order to live well. So we learn to do it. It doesn't have to have a lot of fanfare, but we learn that there's things that are important for us to do in our life that we don't feel like doing. We don't feel like doing our taxes. We don't feel like getting out of bed on a Sunday morning. We don't feel like going to the gym. We don't feel like eating vegetables instead of
we're already doing this in other areas of our lives.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
We're just not conscious of them at this point.
Yeah. And if you think about, well, how is it that we've already learned to do that? Well, we've already learned to do it because we probably have been doing it regularly, right? Most of us do get out of bed every morning. And so we've learned that. For some people, they've got a lot of practice sessions in passing up dessert, for example, right? They've done that, not all the time, but regularly enough where they have that option to say, whether it's dinner at a friend's house or at a restaurant or passing a bakery, they have the experience of saying no to something that they actually feel like eating. But for people who have often an eating problem, if they're just going with their feelings on a regular basis, they don't have a lot of successful experience with that. The craving comes up and they gravitate towards the thing that they're craving. And so what we want to do in that situation, and I'm using food as an example, but could be sex, it could be, anything that we find ourselves drawn towards in terms of our feelings and thoughts, that we have to learn through experience to be able to restrain ourselves from in those situations. And as we start doing that, we start developing the capacity to do it more and better.
What about motivation? Is motivation something that follows action, or is it something that can also precede action? And how do you look at it from a Morita therapy standpoint?
Well, I think the first thing I would say about motivation, when we think about motivation, we often think about, let's use exercise as an example. I think it's relevant to a lot of us. We think that, my problem is the reason that I'm not exercising is I'm just not motivated. I just don't feel motivated to exercise, or even I don't feel motivated to exercise today. So it's the idea that because we don't have a particular feeling state, that we can't take the action, right? And the logical principle following that is that if you want to take the action, you have to change your feeling state. You have to somehow get yourself motivated or psych yourself up, right? I've got to motivate myself in order to study for my exam. I've got to get myself motivated so I can go to the gym and exercise or go out jogging. And the way that I would look at it is that motivation isn't necessary. If you feel motivated to go and exercise, that's wonderful. But if you don't, just don't feel motivated, but go to the gym anyway, if that's really important for you to do. So in other words, we don't try to change that feeling state. We just simply bypass that. And we have a maxim in our work, that very simple maxim called lead with the body. And it means that when you're in a situation and there's something that you need to do, and maybe you don't feel like doing it, maybe you have thoughts basically about how to get out of it, or just basically procrastinating on it, that you lead with the body. In other words, instead of having your mind take the first step, which is, okay, I'm going to go to the gym now, you just let your mind have whatever thoughts it has, and your body gets off the couch, and your body takes the lead in pulling you over to the door, putting on your gym shoes, grabbing your gym bag, walking out to the car and getting in the car and driving to the gym. And by leading with your body, it doesn't really make much difference what's going on in terms of your feelings or in terms of your thoughts, actually. Your body's in charge. And what we find, and a lot of people can check this with their own experience, but for me, for example, there's a lot of days I don't feel like working out or going for a bike ride or going to the gym. But 95% of the time, when I do end up riding my bike, going to the gym, swimming. Those are all things that I do. Halfway through or somewhere around that point, I actually am glad I did it. I actually feel good. I'm having thoughts like, oh, it's really great that I decided to go to this yoga class instead of just laying around on the couch at home. So my thoughts and my feelings have shifted, not before I take the action, but as a result of taking the action. So what we're seeing is that it makes much more sense to think of our behavior as having a logical or a likely influence on our thoughts and feelings than to try to get our thoughts and feelings in order so that we can act or behave in a particular way.
Let's apply this to maybe some specific situations. So let's say that I lost a job, or I had a business that went bankrupt, or it could be a divorce, something in terms of a setback, a personal setback.
Okay.
How would one recover or pick oneself up from those setbacks and move forward using these concepts? I'm assuming maybe the first step is accepting where you are and accepting the situation. But how would you advise someone in that situation? How can we benefit from this in those type of situations?
Sure. And, all the examples that you gave are examples that are likely to stimulate very strong and uncomfortable or even painful feeling states, right? To be fired from your job or laid off, to find yourself at the tail end of a divorce proceedings, or any of those kinds of examples and many other things can often leave you in a very strong sense of depression or upset or resentment or anger. So one of the first things that I think we want to do is be able to step back and look at the situation and be able to accept the circumstances that we're in. Doesn't mean we're going to be passive, but it means we start by looking around, saying, what do we have here? And accepting that. There's a Zen cook this man who wrote the Tassajara bread book. And he would say that when he went into the kitchen to cook a meal, he always started by looking around and saying, what do we have here? Before he figured out what he was going to cook, he wanted to see, what is the situation, right? And so here's a situation. I was laid off from my job. I don't have a job anymore. I'm living here. I've got certain expenses. I've got this much money in the bank. I've got this much severance pay in a check that I'm going to get next week. So we're essentially assessing the situation, even though we have these incredibly strong feelings about what happened, right? And then the question is, what do I need to do in this situation? Do I need to try to find a job in the next 3 days? Because if I don't, they're going to repossess my car or foreclose on my house? Or do I have a few months? In other words, what is it that needs to be done and when does it need to be done? And as you start doing those things, you're going to have a lot of feelings about it. If you've been working at the same job for 10, 15, 25 years and you're laid off, it's going to feel very awkward and often stimulate a lot of anxious feelings and thoughts to put together a resume and start applying for other jobs, particularly if you're older. But you do those things even though you have those feelings because you recognize that you can't control those feelings, but there are things that you need to do. And one of the things that I offer people as a way to work with their feelings, since we're not trying to change them, is to look at how you can work with your attention. So here's a very, I think, amazing concept that generally is very different than you would find in Western therapy, which is the idea that you're only anxious when you're paying attention to your anxiety. You're only depressed when you're paying attention to your depression. In other words, the question of where is your attention, if you think of attention like a flashlight, and if your attention is on your feelings, there's depression. But if your attention is on the sunset, or your attention is on your kid in the backyard playing with your new little puppy, or your attention is on gardening or cleaning your kitchen, when your attention is shifted to the world around you in that moment, you're not anxious. You're not depressed. That you may feel depressed in the next moment, but in that moment, you're not. So one of the things that we teach people is to use that shift of attention as a way to relieve some of the suffering that comes with those strong, intense, unpleasant feelings. Some of this, you can go back and you can see that. I remember decades ago when I had knee surgery and I read a book by Norman Cousins, and he talked about, in order to get off of painkillers, watching funny movies in the hospital as he was recovering from life and death surgery. And he was amazed at how much he could reduce his pain medication by watching these funny Mel Brooks movies. And it's because of that shift of attention, right? Even with pain, when we're not noticing pain, we're not actually experiencing pain. We may still have a broken bone, but in that moment, when we're laughing at a joke or laughing at a scene in a movie, in that moment, we're not experiencing pain or depression or anxiety. So we teach people how to work with their attention. It's actually one of the other skills that I write about is the skill of being able to work with your attention. And a big part of that skill is shifting your attention away from yourself and onto the world around you.
Is meditation helpful in that regard?
I meditate, and I have for many decades, and I recommend it to people. And meditation is particularly helpful from a psychological standpoint in giving us the ability to step back from our feelings and thoughts and just observe them. So in basic meditation, like Zen meditation, or what we call shikantaza, just sitting, we're able to sit there quietly, often with a great deal of stillness in our body, and just watch thoughts come up and just watch feelings come up. And so we're cultivating the ability to observe what's going on inside us. And sometimes that thought can be, I'm sick and tired of meditating. I want to get something to eat. But we watch that thought. We don't get up and get something to eat. We simply notice that thought. And then here comes another thought, like, this is really boring. I wonder how much time we have before they're going to ring the bell. And we watch that thought come up. So what we do in meditation, as we cultivate the ability to observe our thoughts and feelings, helps us in life when we're dealing with particularly uncomfortable thoughts and feelings. If we can also observe those thoughts, right? Here's this thought that, I can't take this anymore. I'm going to quit my job right now. And we watch that thought come up, but we don't necessarily write our resignation and give it to our boss, because maybe that's not a good idea at this moment. Or we can have angry feelings. We can have shy feelings. We notice these feelings of shyness. We're in a social gathering. We see someone we'd like to talk to, maybe someone of the opposite sex or same sex, but we have these shy feelings and we have thoughts like, well, what if the person doesn't want to talk to me? What if they don't like me? What if they just simply turn around and walk away? And we notice those thoughts and we notice those feelings, but we walk 6 steps and we walk over to the person and we say, hi, my name is Larry. We introduce ourselves, even though we're having these thoughts and feelings. So meditation can be a wonderful way of practicing, of training ourselves to be able to use that same idea of observing and noticing our thoughts and feelings when we're not on a meditation cushion, when we're out in the real world and we don't want to necessarily be simply reacting to what's going on in our inner world.
Yeah, I think that's been probably the biggest benefit that I've had from meditation is separating from the thoughts. The thoughts still come up, but I'm better able to be aware of them versus just identify with them. One of the things that I read in your book that I enjoyed was the Morita work providing relief when we begin to see, there was a phrase in the book, when we begin to see thoughts as happening to us, similar to the rain falls or a gust of wind blows across the yard. I thought the way that sentence was structured, that hit home for me because it's a very good explanation of really how you can separate from thoughts when you realize that, or help you not identify with them, right? If you can see them as happening to you, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think so many people have this sense that somehow, and again, this is promoted in certain types of approaches and traditions in the West, that we're creating our thoughts. We're responsible for our thoughts. And so I take the exact opposite kind of view that it's much more like our thoughts are happening to us. I just was at the chiropractor recently and getting an adjustment in my back. And I said, what, why would this happen? I haven't really been doing anything different. I'm just, biking and doing a little yoga and swimming. She said, what? A lot of this is just random. It's not like you do something specifically that causes this to happen. It just happens. And I remember how surprised I was to think that this can actually just be something that happened. It doesn't mean it's because I'm out of shape or it's because I'm not stretching enough. Those can contribute to it. But there are times when we just have a back problem because something just happens to us. And I think it's the same thing with thoughts, that we can have thoughts, angry thoughts, we can have perverted thoughts, we can have irresponsible thoughts, sexual thoughts, just And if we begin to see that these are thoughts that are just happening to us, there was a Zen teacher named Uchiyama Roshi who uses the term, and I love this phrase, he uses the term secretions in our mind, that our thoughts are secretions in our mind. So this idea of not identifying with that thought, just seeing it as the clouds or a storm passing in the sky, something that's happening to us. And I think that that's part of what we get from meditation is we're able to do that, to begin to observe those thoughts, distance ourselves from those thoughts, and see that it's not like I'm creating this thought about wanting to go eat breakfast instead of meditating. It's just a thought that just came up. And it's a thought that will dissolve in a very short period of time. And then it'll be replaced by another thought that will just come up.
Yeah, I think Sam Harris, I don't know if you've read any of his work. He's a neuroscientist and philosopher, but he was talking about the mechanics of the brain, and he was talking about automatic thoughts. So people can kind of Google it and look it up. But where, try as they might, people really can't trace where a thought comes from. Is there a specific type of meditation that you recommend in this regard? Or I think you just said sitting still. And is there a specific type of meditation you recommend for people just starting out or trying to implement some of the concepts of Morita?
I think that for people to meditate in a way that helps them to cultivate this observer of their thoughts and feelings in their inner world, you want to use a meditation in which you are not trying to do anything in your mind. In other words, it's fine if you're just following your breath. You notice your breath coming in, you notice your breath coming out. There's other forms of meditation. Even in Zen, there's koan meditation where you're concentrating on a koan or this kind of a Zen riddle that you might have been given by your teacher. And that's a different type of meditation. There's meditations in Vipassana where you have loving kindness kinds of meditations where you're actually using your mind in a very purposeful way. The kind of meditation that I'm describing that I think is helpful for this particular purpose is really one in which you're simply just sitting there or following your breath and just allowing what comes up to come up and noticing it and just returning to your breath. So you have that experience of just being able to observe what's going on in your mind, what's going on in terms of your feeling without acting on it. And that to me is wonderful practice for what you do when you get off your meditation cushion.
You write about Kaizen, which is a Japanese business philosophy of continuous improvement in the context of personal change. Can you elaborate on that?
Kaizen is one of the three approaches in Japanese psychology that we work with. So there's Morita therapy and Kaizen, which kind of complement one another. And so there are people within the psychology community, a man named Robert Moore is one of them, who have really taken some of the principles of Kaizen and applied them to personal change or psychotherapy. I find that Kaizen is a really nice fit with Morita therapy. What Kaizen it does is it gives you specific techniques. So in my book called The Art of Taking Action, I talk about Kaizen and the importance of taking small steps. That's one of the essential ingredients of Kaizen is this idea of small steps, incremental change, but consistent small steps. And so if you want to write a novel, instead of deciding, okay, I'm going to start my novel and I'm just going to write, for 8 hours over the weekend on Saturday, another 8 hours on Sunday. And maybe you can do that. But for people who have been wanting to write for a long time and find that they're not writing, a much better approach is to simply say, okay, I'm going to commit to sitting down and writing one paragraph before I get up, or maybe even one sentence before I get up. And once you've accomplished that sentence or maybe accomplished that paragraph, then you can continue writing or you can just get up and you've honored your commitment. And the idea isn't that if you write a sentence a day, obviously if you write a sentence a day, it's going to take you a long time to write a novel. But what will happen for most people is once you're actually sitting down with your computer and your keyboard in front of you and you're starting to write, most of us, if we get through a paragraph, we'll probably write a second paragraph. And if we write 2 paragraphs, we might write a whole page. And so you may find that even though your commitment was, let's say, to a paragraph, that you actually sat down and spent 40 minutes or 50 minutes or an hour, and you've got a couple of pages. And the key is that you're creating momentum. So if we look at the laws of physics, that an object in motion will stay in motion, right? unless an outside force is exerted on it. And so as we're developing this momentum by writing every day or by exercising every day or by meditating every day, even if it's just for a couple of moments, we're developing that momentum. And we're working with the laws of physics in the sense that we're much more likely to then keep up that practice of writing every day or meditating every day as we continue to do that and develop more and more momentum. That's a principle from Kaizen that is started out in an organizational or an industrial setting, but it's really helpful, I think, from a standpoint of making changes and accomplishing things in our personal lives.
One of my favorite passages or pieces in your book was the maxim, start before you're ready, don't prepare, begin. And you say, remember, our enemy is not lack of preparation. It's not the difficulty of the project or the state of the marketplace or the emptiness of our bank account. The enemy is resistance. And then what I really liked was you go further and say the problem is most of us associate figuring out things with thinking. And so we imagine Einstein at his blackboard spending days writing complex equations. And obviously this works because he's a physicist or a mathematician, but in real life, that could keep us stuck. Can you elaborate on this? And how do we minimize or stop over preparing and just starting?
First of all, I just want to clarify that the first quote that you, I think, read from my book is actually a quote from, I believe, from Stephen Pressfield, who wrote a wonderful book called The War of Art. And I recommend it to anybody who feels stuck because he does a wonderful job in that book. And he talks about his focus is really on this issue of resistance. But in terms of following up on that what I find is that the more intelligent a person is, the more likely that they are moving through life based on the idea you have to figure out life in your mind before you can actually take action or move, right? And we have a maxim that goes, you can't figure out life in your mind, right? So don't even try to do that. You can maybe in your mind figure out what you want to make for dinner and get a recipe out and cook. But in terms of the complexity of life and trying to project what we need to do into the future, you can't figure out life in your mind. And people who are smart often have this predisposition to trying to do that. And that in itself will get you stuck. If you're trying to figure out how to make some big change in your life, and the idea is that you've got to have this all mapped out in your mind or on paper before you can act, then what will happen in many cases is that you won't act at all because you won't get to that point where you feel like you have things figured out. So the alternative is to basically figure out what's the first step. And if you've already started, then you figure out what's the next. And you take that step without knowing where you're going to go from there. You just simply take the next step, even if it's a small step. And when you take that step, the action itself creates ripples in the world. And then you look around and say, oh, well, that's interesting that this happened. So what's the next step I need to take here? So instead of trying to use your mind to figure out your life, you're using action to figure out your life.
And in applying this to our lives, and Gregg, this has been great. But when we're applying this to our lives or trying to apply this to our lives, it looks like in your books or in your book and others that I read regarding Morita, there's these maxims or heuristics or sayings like start before you're ready, don't prepare, begin, things of that nature. What do we have? This is what we start with. Do we put these on a 3x5 card and look at them, remind ourselves of them every day? I'm trying to figure out a practical way to ingest this and make it a daily thought process, if that makes sense.
I think maxims are helpful because they're great reminders and often they're easier to remember. But the real key is not the maxims or the reading or even remembering those ideas. The real key is actually learning by doing. And so if people want to write a maxim like lead with the body and put it on their refrigerator, I think that's great. But what we try to do is to give people exercises, something that you can do every single day so that you're actually getting a daily practice. And I teach a series of online courses over the year. I think about 5 different courses, and they're all 30-day courses. So one of them, for example, is called Working with Your Attention. Another one is called The Art of Taking Action. And every course I teach always has a daily exercise. So every morning in your email box, you'll have a little exercise. This is your assignment today. And it's always a behavioral assignment. It's not read page 21 and 22 in this book. It's do this particular thing with your attention. So for instance, in the attention course, one of the exercises would be to, throughout the day, try to notice shadows of things instead of the things themselves. So you're taking a walk, or you're walking to work, or you're walking your dog, and you're looking around and you're actually trying to notice the shadows of the trees or the leaves or the rocks or the playground swing set instead of looking at the things themselves. And it's a wonderful way to start getting your attention to notice something different, right? But it's the exercise, it's doing the exercise that makes the difference. And the same thing in terms of taking action. What is the exercise that you can do every single day? So if you're a writer, one of those exercises is to write every day, whether you feel like it or not, at a particular time, right? Sit down and don't get up until you've written a paragraph or until 10 minutes goes by or 15 minutes goes by. It would be an example of an exercise. Another exercise that has to do with restraint, for example, is if you have a craving for something, and again, I'll go back to food because it's a common area of challenge for a lot of us. If you have a craving for something and you have it in the house, when you notice that craving, go and look at it, open the refrigerator door, see that piece of cake, or open the pantry and see the box of chocolates, look at it, and then go back to doing something else and wait 20 minutes before you eat it. In other words, the exercise isn't don't eat it, although that would be a good exercise, but just delay eating it by 20 minutes, just so you learn that you can coexist with that feeling of wanting to eat that chocolate and not eating it for 20 minutes. So that's a great exercise. But what you would see if you actually were in a training program of mine is that every day you're working with an exercise. Every day you're trying to cultivate this material to make it part of your life and part of who you are, not through reading or through posters or through even talking, but through actually doing the practice itself. And so just as somebody who wants to be able to get really good at shooting free throws in a basketball game, what do? After school, they go to the gym, and every day they shoot 50 free throws. Every day they shoot 100 free throws. If you're a baseball pitcher in junior high or high school and you want to be a great pitcher, every day you're basically throwing 50 or 100 pitches. And through that, you become a good pitcher. And through that, you become a good free throw shooter.
So action and willpowers can be a learned behavior. It's something you can learn.
I think that what the skill that you're really learning is...
Or skill you develop. I'm sorry, skill
right.
You can develop.
So you can learn the skill of being able to do the things that you do in your life that you need to do, even when you don't feel like it. And that's really the heart of procrastination for most people, is not doing something because they don't feel like doing it. So think about what you could accomplish in your life if you could do the things that are important for you to do, even when you don't feel like doing them. It's a huge shift for most of us. And it's not just that we get more things checked off on our errands or checklist, but if we're prioritizing things right, we were really talked about this, if we're really identifying the things that are meaningful, that are important for us to do, it's not just that we're checking off our daily to-do list. It means that we're writing books and we're creating art in the world and we're becoming proficient at playing blues piano and all the things that we've dreamed about doing, learning a foreign language that are important to us. We're now being able to actually move forward on those kinds of aspirations in our life, the things that have been sitting around for months, years, even decades, because we just haven't been able to get around to doing them.
Yeah, one of the things that has helped me, I've just read something that, because I tend to overthink. When I find myself, having to do something and starting to overthink it, there's something I just read called the 5-second rule where, if you think too long, you're probably going to delay it or not do something. So there's, this concept of counting down 5 seconds, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and just doing it, not giving yourself time to overthink, which I found helpful, just a little hack. But one of the things I would encourage you, Gregg, I don't know if you've heard of Highbrow, but people from all over the world can sign up for 10-day little short email courses. And I think some of the concepts that you teach and courses you teach can be condensed. It'd probably be a big hit on that platform. It's called Highbrow. I think it's gohighbrow.com, but it's just you can get a free email course, 10 days, but you go through this platform, people can sign up, and it's very popular. And I think it's also another way to get more and more people aware of Morita and the teachings that you have in the Institute and what have you. So I would check it out.
Because thank you. I appreciate that.
Because these exercises seem perfect for that type of medium, right? I would sign up right away, right? It's like, oh, okay, I get it in the email in the morning. It reminds me to take an action. Anyway, check that out. And the last thing, and we'll wrap this up because this has really been helpful to me for sure, but for those of us who are indecisive about something, there's 50 options and we're trying to figure out what to do. Are there any concepts or principles that apply here? Or would you just say, try one, that didn't work out, try the next one? You know what I mean? It's sequential decision-making, or what do you recommend for indecision?
Well, I think I write about that a little bit in the book, but basically what we don't want to do is to use our energy to constantly be ruminating about which choice we should make. And in many cases, the underlying assumption is that there is a right choice. My youngest daughter is about to go to college in the fall. She's going to college at DePaul University in Chicago. And, she got accepted at a number of colleges.
Oh, congratulations.
Well, thank you. I will pass that on to her. But, it's a classic example where, let's say you've got 5, 6, 7 colleges and you have the opportunity to go to any one of those colleges. How do you decide? And if you start from the assumption that there's a right answer, and so the fear is that you're going to, if there's 7 colleges, that what if you choose one of the other 6 and you don't pick the right one? Think about all the anxiety that creates. If you start with the assumption that there is no right answer, that there's so many unpredictable variables in terms of your college experience, there's no way to even know, what would be the best choice here. But in addition to that, most of the outcome of that choice is what you do after you make the decision. Once you're actually at school, that's where your conduct and your behavior and your choices will make a huge difference. So if we realize that it's not that there's a right choice, we basically make the best choice we can, or even if we flip a coin, the key thing is what we do after we make that choice. How do we implement the choice that we've decided on? And so for people who are indecisive about something, I think even if you end up flipping a coin, that's fine. But go ahead with something and then invest all of your energy into trying to make that work, whatever that choice was. Because it's really not the choice that's nearly as important as what you do in your life after you make that choice.
Helpful. Thank you very much. Letting us know about the ToDo Institute. And the Japanese pronunciation again is ToDo?
The Japanese word is ToDo or ToDo Institute, which means Eastern Way.
And that's they can find you at todoinstitute.org.
That's correct. Yeah, we have a bookstore online. My books are also on Amazon if people want to take a look at them on Amazon. And I have a number of books out that range from the self-reflection side of the material to the action side of the material. So we think it's always a good place to start by reading. But all of my books always include at least a sample of exercises. So if you are reading something, again, I encourage you to at some point put the book down and actually put what you're reading into practice by some type of assignment or exercise that you give yourself.
Gregg, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, well, thank you, Larry. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I've enjoyed our conversation, and I hope things really blossom for you in terms of the show and what you're able to do and as far as getting some important ideas and material out into the world.
Well, that's a wrap. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed it, do share it with your friends and on your social platforms. Big thanks to Sam Williams, my audio guy, and the beautiful bumper music you're hearing is Michael Petrovich's Bella Luna. For all my show notes or resource links, visit larryweeks.com, and we will talk again soon.